Welcome to Creepy Campfire Tales, where the world of the unexplained, the mysterious, and the terrifying comes to life. We dive into haunted places, ghostly encounters, and chilling folklore that will make you question what lurks in the shadows. Each story is carefully crafted to pull you into the unknown, whether it's supernatural legends, real-life mysteries, or urban myths. There's always a tale waiting to send shivers down your spine. And the best part? You're never alone. You're part of our community of brave souls, always ready for one more terrifying story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Welcome to Creepy Campfire Tales, where every fire holds a dark secret. Jake and Emma were tired but determined. They'd been driving for hours following the narrow stretch of Route 6. The road is famous for strange accidents and disappearance. Locals called it the Devil's Highway, but they shrugged it off as just another legend. "Let's stop for a bit," Emma said, pointing to a deserted gas station. The sign was rusted, the pumps long dead. Jake hesitated but pulled over, the car crunching on the gravel. As soon as they stepped out, the wind picked up, howling through the empty station. "I don't like this place," Emma whispered, looking around nervously. "Come on, it's just a stop. Let's stretch your legs." But the moment they walked towards the building, things felt wrong. The temperature dropped instantly, and the air smelled like burning rubber. Emily's phone vibrated in her pocket. She checked it and frowned. "No service," she muttered. Jake glanced at the road behind them, now wrapped in an unnatural fog. The thick mist rolled in like a living thing, swallowing the road and surrounding them. Suddenly the lights in the gas station flicked, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Jake, did you see that?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. Before Jake could answer, a low growl echoed from the station. It wasn't an animal. It sounded too deep, too wrong. "Get back to the car," Jake whispered, backing away slowly. They turned toward their car, but something was standing in front of it. A man, or what looked like a man, in a long, tattered coat. His face was pale, almost gray, eyes sunken into hollow pits. "Need a lift?" the figure asked, in a voice that sounded like broken glass. He smiled, revealing blackened teeth. Jake grabbed Emily's hand and bolted for the car. The man was gone in an instant. They reached the car, but when Jake tried the door, it wouldn't open. Emily fumbled with the keys, panic rising. "I locked it when we got out," she cried. "Just unlock it now," Jake shouted. The fog thickened around them. A sharp, ear-piercing screech filled the air, as if metal was being ripped apart. They both turned and froze. The man in the coat stood just a few feet away, only now his face was twisted, his eyes glowing with a sickly green light. "You're on my road now," he whispered, his voice crawling up their veins. Suddenly the ground beneath their feet shifted. The road cracked open, revealing an abyss of fire and ash. From the pit, skeletal hands reached out, crawling at the edges. The temperature skyrocketed as the smell of sulfur filled the air. "We need to go now," Emily screamed, finally unlocking the car. They both drove inside, slamming the doors shut. Jake floored the gas, but the tires screeched in place. Something was holding the car back. Jake looked in the rear mirror and gasped. The man was standing behind the car, his hands gripping the bumper, his eyes burning with fire. "Let's see if you can't escape the curse," the man growled, his voice deep and hollow. He yanked the car back, the tires screeching against the pavement, smoke coming from the engine. Suddenly the ground erupted, and massive chains shot up from the road, wrapping around the car like iron snakes. The vehicle shook violently as the chains pulled it toward the fiery pit. "Jake, do something!" Emily screamed, tears streaming down her face. Jake slammed the car into reverse and stomped on the gas. The engine roared, and with a loud snap the chains broke free. The car lurched backward, sending them spinning out of control. They shot down the highway at breakneck speed, the fog chasing them like a living nightmare. Jake didn't look back, but he could feel it, the man, the curse, still following them. They drove for miles, pushing the car to its limits, until suddenly the fog lifted and the road ahead was clear. Emily sat, shaking, in the passenger seat, her face pale. "What was that?" she whispered. Jake didn't answer. He couldn't. All he knew was that they had escaped, or had they? As they sped away, neither noticed the sign they had just passed. "Welcome to Route 6, the highway to hell." But there was no exit. They were still on the cursed road, and deep down they knew it was only a matter of time before the highway claimed them too. Mark and Sarah had been driving for hours, lost in the maze of back roads, after their GPS stopped working. The only sign of life was the narrow stretch of pavement winding endlessly through the trees, and even that felt like it was leading them deeper into nowhere. "I'm telling you, we should have hit a town by now," Sarah said, her voice tight with frustration. She glanced at her phone. Still no signal. "Relax, we'll find something," Mark replied, though his grip on the steering wheel was tense. A small wooden sign appeared in their headlights. "Detour, next right." Mark slowed down. "Should we try it?" Sarah hesitated. "I don't know. This road already feels weird, and a detour in the middle of nowhere." Mark sighed. "We're low on gas. We haven't seen another road for miles. Let's try it." The detour led them down a narrow gravel road that twisted through thick woods, the trees pressed in on either side, branches creaking in the wind. The deeper they drove, the more isolated it felt. There were no houses, no lights, just the looming trees and the crunch of gravel under their tires. "This can't be right," Sarah muttered. The road was getting rougher, the car bouncing on the uneven surface. "Maybe we should turn back." Mark slowed down, squinting at the road ahead. "I'm not sure we can. Look." The road behind them was completely engulfed in fog, thick and impenetrable. There was no turning back now. They kept going until the road suddenly ended at a rusted old gate. A sign hung crookedly from the gate, barely readable. "Dead End." Mark's stomach dropped. "Seriously? We should have listened to our gut," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Great," he muttered, opening the door. "I'll see if I can push us out." As he stepped into the cold night air, the wind whipped through the trees, making them groan like something alive. He moved to the back of the car, but when he put his hands on the trunk, a sharp noise made him freeze. It was faint, at first, a soft scraping sound like something metal being dragged across the ground. He looked around, but the only thing he could see were the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. "Did you hear that?" he called to Sarah, trying to keep his voice steady. "Hear what?" she said, leaning out of the car window. The scraping sound came again, louder this time. Mark's heart raced. It was coming from behind the gate, deep in the woods. Slowly a figure stepped into view. From the fog, it was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was wearing a long coat, but something was off. His movements were too slow. "Hey!" Mark shouted, waving his arms. "Can you help us?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it continued dragging something behind it, a long, rusted piece of metal. The sound sent shiver down Mark's spine. "Mark, get in the car," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, Mark could see more clearly. The man's face was pale, almost gray. His eyes were dark. His hands gripped the metal object tightly. A crowbar, bent and twisted. "Mark now!" Sarah yelled. Mark rushed to the driver's seat, slamming the door behind him. He tried to start the car, but the engine wouldn't start. Come on," he muttered, turning the key again. The figure was now just feet from the car, his hollow eyes fixed on them. "What does he want?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Mark didn't answer. He jammed the key into the ignition again, and the engine roared to life. He slammed the car into reverse, and the tires finally caught traction, pulling them backward. But as they moved, the figure stepped into the road, blocking their path. "Go around him," Sarah shouted. Mark swerved, narrowly missing the man. As they sped down the narrow road, the fog closed in around them, making it hard to see. The road twisted and turned, and no matter how far they drove, the gate seemed to reappear ahead of them, the dead end sign swaying in the wind. "This can't be happening," Mark muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. "We're stuck," Sarah whispered, tears welling in her eyes. The scrapping sound returned, louder now, echoing through the trees. Mark slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in front of the gate once again. They were trapped. There was no way out. Suddenly the car's lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. The sound of metal scrapping grew closer and closer. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. Then in the dim moonlight, they saw him again. The figure stood just outside the driver's window, his face inches from the glass, his hollow eyes locked into Mark's eyes. And in the faint light, Mark could see his lips moving, though no sound came out. Without warning, the figure raised the crowbar and smashed it against the window. Glass shattered, and Mark and Sarah screamed, scrambling to get out of the car. But when Mark opened the door, the figure was gone. The woods were silent, the fog lifting as if nothing happened. Shaking, they stumbled back into the car. The road was clear now, the gate gone. They didn't say a word as Mark started the car and drove in silence. Hours later, when they finally reached the nearest town, they stopped at a gas station, heart still pounding. As the attendant filled up the tank, he noticed the look on their faces. "You two all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Mark shook his head, still too shaken to speak. Sarah glanced at the road behind them, the empty, winding road that had led them there. "Just took a detour," she whispered, "but we're not going back." It wasn't late, too late to still be driving. Ben and Lisa had been on the road for hours, the highway stretching endlessly in front of them. The darkness seemed to swallow everything around their car, except for the occasional flash of headlights from passing trucks. "We should stop," Lisa said, her voice tense. "We've been driving for 10 hours straight. Just find the next rest stop, please." Ben nodded, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. The GPS showed a rest stop just 5 miles ahead. "Almost there," he muttered, focusing on the road. As they pulled off the highway and into the small rest area, something immediately felt strange. The place was eerily quiet. No cars, no people, just a single flickering street light, casting long, shadowy beams over the cracked pavement. The building that housed the bathrooms and vending machines looked old, almost abandoned. A rusty sign above the entrance read, "Last rest stop for 50 miles. "Why is it so empty?" Lisa whispered. Ben shrugged. "Maybe we just got lucky. Let's stretch our legs and get some snacks." They stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at their skin. The rest stop was surrounded by tall, dark trees, and the silence was unsettling. Ben headed toward the vending machine, while Lisa walked to the restroom. As Ben fumbled for change, he heard footsteps, quick, shuffling steps. But when he looked around, there was no one. He felt a chill run up his spine. "Lisa," he called out, but there was no answer. He headed toward the restroom, but stopped in his tracks when he saw the door. It was slightly ajar, and from the crack he could see a light flickering inside. Ben pushed the door open slowly. The bathroom was empty, but something was not right. The mirrors were fogged over as if someone had just taken a hot shower, and written on the mirror were the words, "Leave now." His heart pounded. "Lisa," he shouted again, louder this time. No response. Ben rushed outside, panic rising. He scanned the parking lot, but their car was the only one there. The place felt suffocating, like the darkness was closing in on him. Suddenly he saw her, Lisa, standing at the edge of the lot, facing the woods. She was still, too still. Lisa, he ran toward her, but as he got closer, he froze. Something was strange. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, they were wide open, staring blankly into the trees. Lisa, what's going on? He whispered, reaching out to touch her shoulder. But when his hand made contact, her body crumbled like ash, collapsing into a pile at his feet. Ben stumbled back, horrified. His mind raced. This couldn't be real. His heart pounded in his chest. This low, raspy growl echoed from the woods. Something was out there, something watching him. Suddenly the flickering streetlight cut out, plunging the entire rest stop into darkness. Ben's breath hitched as he heard footsteps again, slow steps coming from the direction of the woods. Without thinking, he bolted for the car. He yanked the door open, jumped in, and slammed it shut. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life. Ben raced out of the rest stop, his tires screeching on the asphalt. As he sped down the highway, his eyes darted to the rear view mirror. For a moment he saw it, something dark and shadowy standing in the middle of the road watching him. It had no face, no form, just a tall, dark figure with glowing eyes. Ben's hands clutched the steering wheel as he pressed harder on the gas. He didn't stop driving until the sun came up. He never found out what happened to Lisa. She was just gone. The rest stop disappeared from the GPS like it never existed. But every time he drove that highway again, he could swear he saw the flickering light in the distance, a reminder of the last rest stop, the one no one ever came back from. The wind howled outside the car as Danny gripped the steering wheel tighter. The GPS had rerouted him down this old, deserted highway. A shortcut through the countryside. He cursed himself for agreeing to take the detour. The road was narrow, surrounded by tall, twisted trees that seemed to lean in closer the further he drove. His girlfriend Leah sat in the passenger seat, staring nervously out the window. "I don't like this road," she whispered. "It doesn't feel right." Danny nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. "I know, but it's just a few more miles. We'll be back on the main highway soon." They had been driving for hours, the night stretching on endlessly. The road seemed to go forever, winding deeper into the woods. Danny couldn't shake the feeling that something was so wrong. It wasn't just the creepy trees, or the fact that they hadn't seen another car in what felt like forever. It was something else, something he couldn't explain. Suddenly the radio cut out, filling the car with a low, static hum. Then the GPS screen blinked and went black. "What the hell?" Danny screamed, tapping the screen. "We're in the middle of nowhere." Leah leaned forward, staring at the dashboard. "Look, the clock stopped. It's stuck at midnight." Danny glanced at the clock, his stomach shrinking. Sure enough, the time was frozen. No matter how much he tapped the buttons, it wouldn't reset. "Maybe we should turn back," Leah said, her voice shaky. "This road, it feels wrong." Just as Danny was about to agree, the headlights caught something up ahead. A figure standing on the side of the road. A man, tall and still, dressed in what looked like old tattered clothes. His face was pale, almost glowing in the dim light. Danny slowed the car, his heart racing. "Who is that?" Leah leaned closer to the window, her breath fogging up the glass. "Should we stop?" As they neared the figure, Danny's instinct screamed, "No," but before he could make a decision, the man stepped into the middle of the road, blocking their path. Danny slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching on the pavement. The car came to a sudden stop, just feet away from the figure. The man didn't move, he just stood there, staring at them with hollow eyes. "What do we do?" Leah asked, panic rising in her voice. Danny's hands trembling on the steering wheel. "We have to go around him." Slowly he steered the car to the side, trying to pass the figure. But as they moved, the man's head followed their motion, his eyes never leaving them. Danny's breath quickened. What the hell is wrong with him? Suddenly, without warning, the man disappeared. 1 second he was standing in front of them, and the next, gone. Leah gasped. Where did he go? Danny's heart pounded in his chest. He hit the gas, speeding down the road. I don't know and I don't care. We're getting out of here. But as they drove, the road seemed to stretch on forever. No exits, no intersections, just the same narrow path winding through the dark woods. The trees looked like shadows moving in the corners of their eyes. We've been driving for hours, Leah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Why aren't we out of here yet? Danny shook his head, panic creeping in. I don't know, the GPS is still dead. This road, it's like it doesn't end. Just then, the car jerked violently to the side. Danny fought to keep control as the tires skid on the road. He pulled over to the shoulder, his heart racing. What now? Leah asked, her eyes wide with fear. Danny got out of the car to check the tires. The night air was cold, biting at his skin, but when he looked down, the tires weren't flat. They were shredded, as if something had clawed at them. Deep gashes ran across the rubber, too clean, too deliberate to be caused by the road. Danny, Leah called from inside the car. What's going on? Before he could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the woods. Danny spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. There, standing just at the edge of the tree line, was the same man. Pale, hollow-eyed, and still, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him, more figures emerged from the darkness. Men, women, their faces blank, their clothes tattered and old. They stared at Danny with lifeless eyes. Leah, get in the driver's seat, Danny shouted, rushing back to the car. Now! Leah scrambled into the driver's seat, her hands shaking as she tried to start the engine. Danny jumped in beside her, slamming the door just as the figures began to move, slowly, deliberately, toward the car. They're coming, Leah screamed, jamming the key into the ignition. The car sputtered, refusing to start. Come on, Danny shouted, his eyes darting between Leah and the advancing figures. Suddenly the car roared to life. Leah flooded the gas, and the car sped down the road, the figures disappearing into the darkness behind them. But as they drove, the road twisted and turned, never ending. The clock still stuck at midnight, the GPS dead, and in the distance, standing in the middle of the road again, was the same man, waiting for them. Danny's heart sunk. There was no escaping the road. Leah pressed harder on the gas, the car speeding down, seemingly endless road. Danny looked over at the clock. It was still stuck at midnight, the numbers glowing eerily in the dark. I don't get it. Why can't we leave? Leah's voice cracked with fear. I don't know, but we have to keep moving, Danny replied, his eyes scanning the road ahead. But as they rounded a bend, the headlights illuminated something that made both of them freeze. There in the middle of the road stood the same pale man, his eyes hollow, fixed on the car. This time, though, he was smiling, his lips curling into a grotesque grin. Before Danny could react, the car jolted, the engine sputtering. Leah slammed on the brakes, but the car rolled to a stop on its own. The headlights flickering, the eerie silence returned, only broken by a faint sound of whispering. The man remained where he stood, his grin widening unnaturally. Suddenly the whispers grew louder, surrounding the car like a thick fog. Leah and Danny whipped their heads around, realizing the growing horror that the figures from the woods were now all around them. Dozens of blank faces, their eyes locked on the car, as if waiting. What do we do? Leah whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising hum of the whispers. Danny's breath quickened, his hands trembling. I don't know. Without warning, the headlights flickered out. plunging them into darkness. The whispers grew louder, filling the car. Danny tried to turn the key, but the engine remained dead. A cold breath touched the back of his neck. He turned, and in the rear view mirror, he saw the man from the road sitting in the back seat, his hollow eyes gleaming in the dark, his grin now wide enough to split his face. "You can't outrun the road," the man whispered, his voice like grave, scraping against bone. The figures outside the car began closing in, their face pressed against the windows, hands tapping lightly on the glass, waiting, and then everything went silent. The sun was sinking behind the mountains as Jake and Emily sped down the winding, isolated road. They had been driving all day through the Colorado wilderness, and Devil's Pass was the only route to their cabin for the night. The jagged cliffs on the one side and a steep drop into darkness on the other made the road feel dangerous, even during the day. Now, with the sun almost gone, it felt even worse. "This place gives me the creeps," Emily said, glancing nervously out the window at the sheer drop below. "Why is it called Devil's Pass anyway?" Jake shrugged, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Probably some old local legend. You know how these small towns are. It's just a name." But as they drove deeper into the mountains, something didn't feel so right. The road was too quiet, the air too still. There hadn't been a single car in hours, and the only sounds were the hum of their engine and the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. The last bit of sunlight disappeared, and the darkness closed in around them. "Maybe we should have stayed in town," Emily muttered, rubbing her arms as if to shake off the growing tension. "We're almost there," Jake reassured her. "Just a few more miles and we'll be at the cabin. We'll be fine." But just as the words left his mouth, the car's headlights flickered. "Did you see that?" Emily asked, her voice rising. "Yeah, probably nothing," Jake replied, though he didn't sound convinced. He pressed the gas a little harder, trying to get them off the road as quick as possible. The headlights flickered again, then suddenly the engine sputtered and died. Jake cursed under his breath. He tried turning the key again, but the engine wouldn't start. The only sound was the wind, now louder, howling through the narrow pass. They were completely surrounded by darkness. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, tapping the dashboard. "We just had this thing serviced." Emily was gripping her phone, frantically trying to get a signal. "No service," she said, her voice shaking. "Jake, we're stuck out here." Jake opened the door and stepped out into the cold night air. "Let me check the engine. Maybe it's just a little loose wire or something." Emily stayed in the car, her eyes scanning the darkness. She felt exposed, like the mountain was watching them. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of Jake's footsteps as he walked to the front of the car. He popped the hood, but just as he leaned over to check the engine, he froze. "Emily?" he yelled harshly. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" she asked, her voice tense. There was a sound, soft at first, but growing louder. It was a low, scraping sound, like something dragging itself along the road behind him. Jake turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. His heart raced as he peered into the darkness. "I don't see anything," he muttered, but his voice was unsteady. "Jake, get back in the car," Emily said, her voice raising in panic. "Get back in the car now." Jake took a step back, but then he saw it, just for a second, something moving in the shadows. It was tall, hunched over, with long limbs. It didn't seem to move, like a person's. It was there, then gone, disappearing behind the trees. "Get in the car," Emily screamed. Jake slammed the hood shut and jumped back into the driver's seat. Locking the doors, his hands shook as he tried the ignition again. The engine sputtered, but wouldn't start. Come on," Jake shouted, desperately turning the key. Then there was a loud thud on the roof of the car. Both of them froze, their eyes wide with terror. Something was on the roof, something heavy. The car rocked slightly as whatever it was moved across the top, its weight cracking the metal. "Jake?" Emily whispered, tears welling in her eyes. The sound of claws scraping against metal echoed inside the car. Whatever was up there, it was slowly moving toward the front. Jake's hands gripping the wheel so tightly, his knuckles were turning white. "I'm going to try again," Jake whispered, his voice shaking. Just as he turned the key, the thing on the roof let out a low growl, like something ancient, something that had no place in this world. It was hungry. The car jolted to life, the engine roaring without hesitating. Jake slammed his foot on the gas, and the car shot forward down the road. The thing on the roof slid off, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Jake didn't slow down. The car barreled down the narrow road, the headlights bouncing as they sped around tight curves. Emily was crying softly, her eyes glued to the rear view mirror. It's gone, right?" she whispered. But Jake didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, his heart racing. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches reaching out like hands trying to pull them back. The road stretched on forever with no sign of the cabin, no sign of an end. "Jake, look!" Emily pointed ahead. In the distance, illuminated by the headlights, was a figure standing in the middle of the road, tall, twisted, and wrong. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, reflecting the headlights like a predator's. Jake slammed on the brakes, but the car didn't stop. It skidded, tires screeching, as they lost traction on the gravel road. The figure stood perfectly still, waiting. With a sickening thud, the car hit something, but not the figure. It disappeared just before impact. The car spun, rushing off the road and slamming into a tree. The airbags deployed with a detonating pop, and everything went silent. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world was still, and the only sound there, heavy breathing. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse. Emily nodded, her hands trembling. What was that?" Jake didn't answer. He unbuckled his seatbelt and tried to open the door, but it was jammed. He shoved it open with his shoulder and stumbled out into the cold night air. His head dropped, but all he could think about was getting away. "Emily, we have to go. We can't stay here." But as Emily moved to get out, a shadow loomed over her window. Slowly, she looked up, and her scream pierced the night. Jake turned just in time to see the figure from the road, its long, twisted face pressed against the glass, staring at Emily with those cold, gleaming eyes. Its mouth curled into a grotesque smile, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "Emily!" Jake shouted, running toward the passenger side, but as he reached for the door, the figure vanished into the shadows, leaving only a faint whisper behind. Jake yanked the door open, pulling Emily out of the car. They ran, their footsteps echoing down the empty road. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and the wind carried with it the sound of distant scraping claws. They didn't stop running until they reached the cabin hours later, their bodies exhausted and minds broken from the terror of the night. But even then, as they sat in the safety of the cabin, they could still hear it. The low growl, the faint scraping sound, coming from somewhere in the distance. Whatever was on Devil's Pass was still out there, waiting.